So I think the title that I'm speaking to, which I got off the website, the Manchester Buddhist Centre website a couple of weeks ago, when I suddenly thought, what am I talking about? It's just something about food ethics. I know it's part of Buddhist Action Month, so it is sort of how our practice as Buddhists might affect that big area as to how we sustain ourselves. How might our sort of practice inform what kind of food we eat, where we get our food from, and so on. And actually, as I've been sort of looking into it more, it's a huge area. There's so many different sort of shoulds and shouldn'ts around food. For all sorts of different reasons that they could sort of diminish you to a nervous wreck, kind of sort of, should I eat this, should I eat that, and looking at ingredients and so on. So I thought it's quite important just to think, well, what's the basis of this? Come right back to first principles. Well, we'll see, but I haven't sort of planned a sort of particular long talk. I've got various notes which I might refer to. But really, what I really want to do is sort of root it in the sort of principles of being a Buddhist. What is it about being a Buddhist that should affect how we eat? So what I'd like to do to begin with is actually not to talk, but just suggest that just sitting where you are, you can sit in meditation posture if you wish. I'll just lead through a very short metta bhavana, but it's a metta bhavana with a particular kind of slant. Okay, and I'm doing this because I think that's the sort of root of where we're coming from, really. So just sit composed and still in whatever way you wish. So I'd like to lead through a metta bhavana, but it's metta bhavana particularly focusing on the body. Okay, so in the first part of this, just try and tune in to your own body as we do in meditation. How it feels, a sense of this solidity, shape, form, energy, sensation, consciousness. So this body is what enables us to be alive. With this body, we can walk on the earth. We can have contact with the elements, with water, heat, the air. Just the sheer pleasure of being alive, of being in nature. Pleasure of being conscious, of being able to interact with the world around us and interact with other people. How amazing. So here it is, this body that we've had, or that we've been since we were babies, before that even. Just looking for a sense of gratitude that here is this organism, this ever-changing but in some ways consistent organism, being, form, that's sustained this being alive for the years of your life. So now just bringing somebody else to mind, and it might be a human or it might not be a human. Just bring some other being to mind. Just reflecting that this being also just cherishes being alive, cherishes their body as well. Essentially, that cherishing is the same as what we experience. And now expanding that out into the whole of the natural world. Just thinking of all the beings that make up the world around us. Each of them on some level in their own way, just cherishing their body, cherishing being alive. Joy of being alive. And that's going on right at this moment, in every nook and cranny, in every little ecological niche, in the oceans, the forests, deserts, deep in the earth, in the air. There is consciousness cherishing life. Okay, so just bringing that reflection to a close. So I hope through that you've got in touch or got more in touch with just the foundation of this, which is metta, loving kindness. But metta on quite a sort of basic kind of level, but in a way the most important vital level of just responding to this cherishing of being alive. So very often, there's so many sort of opinions and shoulds and shouldn'ts around the area of food. It's easy to lose sight of this. That's why I wanted to start us off by really being in touch with this sense of cherishing. So in terms of how this affects food, how this affects how we sustain ourselves, as far as I can see, there's sort of three areas which sort of correspond with the three sort of parts of that reflection. So first of all, taking food, sustaining ourselves, is an ethical thing in itself, just in terms of, nourishing ourselves. That's an ethical issue. Just how we eat. Even if it's only for our own sake, even if we're just sort of looking at the effect on ourselves, that's a really important part of it. We can think of food ethics as about the effects on the world or on different animals, but don't forget yourself. That's really vital. It's really important that you are a being to be cherished. That first stage of the metta-bhavana is essential to ethics. So that's sort of one area. Secondly, the effect on other individuals, particularly animals. And I will say quite a lot about animals in this presentation. Both in terms of taking life, but also just the sort of lives that animals lead. And the third area is the effects of food sort of on the wider global ecosystem. So in a way, nature, the natural world, it's not only made of living beings, but it's made of the food of living beings. You might sort of think about the food you've eaten today, for example, and where that's come from. The food that you've eaten has come from a particular field, or probably all over the world, or different fields, different trees, different farms, all sort of come together. It's come to Manchester and you've consumed it, okay? So, imagine, here's another little thought exercise. Imagine that all the food that you eat has actually all comes from one little place, one little plot of land. You've got a kind of super allotment. That's where all your food comes from, okay? Just try and imagine that. How you'd feel about that bit of land. How would you feel if that was threatened or polluted and you were dependent on that for your food? It's almost like that piece of land becomes a kind of extension of ourselves. That feeling that you have when your body is hungry, when it wants food. It's very, very primal, isn't it? It's very sort of basic. The desire for food is very basic. And that desire for food sort of ties us into land, in a way. So, in that thought experiment, it's just one little piece of land, and you imagine you'd get very sort of defensive about it. You'd really be bothered about what was happening to that piece of land. In actual fact, that piece of land is spread all around the world, all around the country, all around the world. But it doesn't mean we should sort of cherish it less, shouldn't sort of feel the connection. It's perhaps not as obvious, but it's there. All our food, everything we take in, comes from the earth, comes from this little globe. Those are three areas: the effect on ourselves, effect on animals in particular, and the wider effect on the earth. And there's really so much to say about each of these. I could stand here and, if I knew enough, give a talk on nutrition. That's an ethical issue. So, what's the sort of quality of food that we take in? Does it sustain, are we getting enough of the right kind of nutrients to sustain an ethical life? Particularly, if you are sort of vegan, or you're restricting your diet in particular ways, it's really important to take care to get the right sort of nutrition. It's out there, the information is out there, but we do need to take some care. Things like the other reason why we need to really pay attention to this is just because there's a whole food industry out there that is trying to get us addicted to really quite unhealthy food, particularly salt, sugar, fat, those three, or a combination of those three things, which is very addictive. And they go to extraordinary lengths to do this. They've got whole departments of people getting just the right crunchiness of biscuit and the right sweetness to get that moreish quality that gets us buying more. They've got whole advertising budgets and so on. Whole kind of merchandising things in supermarkets to draw us to their products. There's a vast industry out there that is just trying to get our money and get us addicted to their product. But it's not necessarily, and in fact in most cases, it's not healthy food. That's an ethical issue for ourselves. Likewise, pesticides. I saw something today on the internet about a Swedish family who just stopped eating anything that wasn't organic, and they took sort of levels of pesticides in their bodies. And there's a dramatic fall in certain sort of chemicals in their bodies. What's that doing to us? What is that doing to our bodies to actually have chemicals inside of us that are designed to sort of kill life? Not much is known about the effect of these on the body. So all of these are sort of personal ethical issues. If we really want to cherish ourselves, cherish our bodies, then it's worth looking at these areas. So the second area I'd like to talk about is the effect on animals, the impact of food on animals. There's a story which you've probably come across, which is it's one of the Jataka tales, I think, or it's a tale about the Buddha when he was a young prince, when he was Prince Siddhartha. Do you know the story of? You've probably seen it in a Buddhist children's storybook. The story of Siddhartha and the swan. Have you come across this? Anyone? Yeah. No. Perhaps not. I probably haven't got time to tell the whole story, but the nub of it is that Siddhartha's cousin Devadatta, who we all know became a kind of arch enemy in later life. But when they were both young cousins living in the palace, Devadatta shot down this wild swan, and it happened that Siddhartha, the future Buddha, was wandering in the grounds and saw this swan sort of plummet to earth, wounded, still with the arrow in. And Siddhartha just went over and decided he wanted to try and save the swan. He took the arrow out. But then Devadatta came along and sort of said, I own that, I shot it, therefore it's mine. And so the two of them had a big argument about it. And this had to be resolved by the king, who was Siddhartha's father. And eventually, after taking wise counsel, the point was made that the swan doesn't belong to anyone. It's still alive. It just belongs to itself. Okay. I think this is the point that sort of Siddhartha argued. And so he was allowed to keep the swan, nurture it back to health and watch it fly off back to the Himalayas or wherever it came from. So, it's a lovely children's story. But there's something quite radical in there, actually, just in that the swan belongs to itself. It's its own being. And I think this sort of points to a very important Buddhist ethic about animals. The Buddha, as you probably know, he sort of was very much against animal sacrifice. And he didn't like his monks sort of eating any food that had been specifically killed for them. And this was quite a departure. This was quite a sort of different way of looking at the animal world. And one that actually, in our society, still seems quite radical. The sort of story of our view of animals is sort of shifting. There's a sort of shift going on, which I think, if it continues, is very sort of positive. Our society's view of animals has been very much influenced by people like Descartes, who actually asserted that animals were just basically automatons, that they're basically sort of machines, and that they might appear to sort of writhe in pain, but don't take that seriously. They're just sort of responding to stimulus. There's nothing kind of actually experiencing it in the middle of that. And this has actually been quite a pervasive sort of view that comes right down to more recent times when people that were doing vivisection experiments were just in their training, they'd be told, no, don't worry about the apparent pain of animals, it's not real. And they would even sort of make fun of those sentimental and ignorant people who protested that this was barbaric. And it's really only in the 1970s, well, it goes back further than that, but in the 1970s, a sort of new paradigm began to emerge, and the birth of the modern sort of animal rights movement took place. And since then, science has really swung very much on the side, and is increasingly swinging on the side of sort of realising that animals, in terms of their experience, are a lot more like us, right? Vastly more like us than we've given them credit for. So just to mention a couple of things. Studies of animals. Well, I'll start with, a few years ago, 2012, a lot of scientists signed something called the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, which really asserted, and this was science in a big way, asserting for the first time, only 3 years ago, that animal consciousness is an actual thing, as it were. I'll just read it out, what they declared. We declare the following. The absence of a neocortex does not appear to preclude an organism from experiencing affective states. Convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviours. Consequently, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures, including octopuses, I don't know why they singled out octopuses, also possess substrates. So the fact that the non-human animals don't have the sort of complexity of language that we have doesn't affect the degree to which they experience pleasure and pain at all. And in fact, it seems that there are some animals that do have more complex language than we thought. Did you know, for example, I found this out the other day, dolphins have names. Dolphins have a unique sort of sequence of squeaks by which they identify individual dolphins. And even birds, so the African grey parrot has been shown to show signs of near human-like levels of consciousness. Again, in terms of a degree of self-awareness and communication and so on. And that's a bird, it's not even a mammal. Likewise, science has told us much more, for example, about, say, elephants. There's that other story you might have come across about the Buddha wandering off one day into the forest and coming across this sort of wild elephant. And it seems there's almost a sort of communication that happens between the Buddha and this elephant that has left its herd and wants a bit of, just like the Buddha, wants a bit of sort of freedom and so on. We now know that elephants are deeply social animals. You can even sort of speak of a kind of culture, a kind of law that is passed down generations of elephants. There was a really interesting thing some years ago, all over the world, they were finding that young male elephants were behaving badly, were just sort of going a bit mad, delinquent elephants. And it was to do with a kind of breakdown of the sort of social structure, in that they no longer had the sort of contact with older male elephants. Without that, they just turned into delinquents and started creating havoc, basically. We also know that elephants experience grief. They have basically sort of grief rituals that they sort of handle the bones of dead relatives. So our knowledge of the sort of inner life of animals is increasing. So perhaps, it takes a long time, but perhaps there's just this sort of long, slow sort of shift happening, to be optimistic, in relation to the animal world. And it's even beginning to impact legally. So just last month, the New Zealand government officially recognised animals as sentient. They passed a law, the Animal Welfare Amendment Bill, that owners must attend properly to the welfare of those animals. And it's brought in laws about animal experimentation, not outlawing it, but saying that it has to be the last resort. The Indian government has recognised the non-human personhood of dolphins. So there are these sort of shifts. But we certainly know that animals, they experience shame, pain. Kenyan elephants have been shown to have nightmares, or even sort of something like post-traumatic stress disorder if they've seen their family killed by poachers and so on. They experience friendship, they experience jealousy, joy, Gorillas apparently sing. Not quite in a sort of musical way that we'd recognise, but they sort of sing. They make a sound, something between a dog whining and a human singing, when they're especially happy. And they experience love. There's a lot of animals that form kind of lasting, loyal mates, for example, like coyotes, apparently. Even perhaps romantic love. There's this description of two coyotes. They first of all, they sort of howl together, coyotes. And then they sort of tap each other with their paws and lick each other's faces. Or the female does that for the man. I don't know which way it works. Then they sort of curl up together and then they mate. So, as one naturalist put it, this looks a lot like romantic love. And, who's, who's to say it isn't? So, in a way, it's obvious, isn't it? I don't know. In a way, isn't it just obvious? Do we really need science to tell us that animals experience these things? But thank goodness science is beginning to sort of come onto the side that actually it matters. So I suppose, it just follows from that. Well, how does that affect, whether we're happy for animals to die for us to get food? How does that affect our sort of view of the food industry, the food production industry? And I think that one of the sort of the crucial thing here is in a way, I've kind of got used to being vegetarian, but there is an argument for saying, well, actually, we need to sort of look more deeply than that. The question that we should be asking isn't about, is this food the flesh of a living being? The question should be more like, how many animals did this food cost? Because, we know, and I'm sure you've come across these sort of statistics, but with things like cows and chickens, animals die. They're not all sort of happily living in fields into their old age. A cow would normally live 20 to 25 years, but the average for a dairy cow is 3 to 5 years. Chickens are normally, and actually that 3 to 5 years is only if you're fortunate enough to be a female of the species. If you're a male of the species, you go straight away. Same with chickens. So basically after 1 or 2 laying cycles, so a chicken lays apparently about 550 eggs in their lifetime. After that, they're killed. It was certainly, I remember in my youth, actually long before as a Buddhist and long before as a vegetarian, but the man that lived next door to us when I was brought up actually ran an abattoir. It was a big sort of modern abattoir near Newcastle, and he showed my sister and myself around, and that sort of really stayed with me, I must say. Just sort of seeing the sort of panic on the faces of the cows and sort of seeing the way that they're actually killed is, never quite left me. But it's not just that, is it? It's also the conditions. Think, an egg, for example, if you eat an egg, that it generally takes not far short of 24 hours for a hen to come up with that egg. So that's 24 hours of life being cooped up in a very small space. Even so-called free range isn't very big. Okay. And I must admit, I mean, I'm not vegan yet, but actually coming across those sort of facts, every time I sort of see an egg, I sort of think there's 24 hours of kind of cooped up imprisonment. Do I really want to eat that egg, you know? So it's good to sort of, I don't know, actually make a kind of connection in that sort of way. So there are also the sort of wider effects of our food, not only on sort of individual animals, but nowadays we also have to sort of think about, well, what's the effect on the wider sort of life support system that is the planet. And it's perhaps a bit more difficult to make an immediate emotional connection because it's a long-term effect, perhaps sort of far away in space and time. But, you know, the food business, the food production business, uses a lot of energy, creates a lot of carbon emissions, uses a lot of water, and it affects quality of soil, pollution of soil, of water. And there's also issues around sort of deforestation and so on. So these are all also, in a way, let's come back to that feeling of cherishing ourselves and cherishing life. The way that food is produced can be undermining, can be sort of taking away other organisms' food, for example, or polluting it, or just making it less healthy, or you know, contributing to climate change, which is a sort of, you know, real long-term threat to all our ability just to cherish being alive, to enjoy being alive. Yeah, I mean, there's just so much information. I don't want to sort of even attempt to say all of it, but certainly there are things around meat production which are problematic. Apparently 18% of greenhouse gases, according to the UN, comes from meat production globally. 18%. So if you are vegetarian, then hooray, you know, you're doing something really good. That's 18% of greenhouse gases that you're no longer contributing to. And that's mostly because meat production requires land to be cleared. It requires particularly tropical forest. But the same applies to sugarcane. Okay, that's another one in the eye for sugar, I'm afraid. Sugarcane is a massive cause of forest clearance, as is palm oil. And palm oil is everywhere in food, things like sort of margarine, and you know, it often sort of crops up in the ingredients of food everywhere, palm oil. And you'll know there's the sort of transportation of food as well. So there's an interesting kind of dilemma came up. I was talking to someone at Butterfield recently who isn't vegetarian, and he owns a little sort of small holding where he very ethically looks after cows and so on. And there was a lot of people at Butterfield saying, oh, you should be vegan, you should be vegan. And he was really having to defend himself. And he did come across, he sort of said, well, you know, recently we had a load of people around and there was one vegetarian there. And they basically they didn't have much vegetables in, so all the vegetables had to go to this vegetarian. And the vegetarian or vegan had to have soya milk. So there they were, next to this quite ethically sourced cow's milk. Ethical, well, not debatable, but possibly ethical, in that the cow was well looked after. But instead, they were drinking soya milk, which had been transported halfway around the world. So we've always got these sort of dilemmas. It's never simple. It's never simple. Generally, there was one study that was done in looking at that sort of dilemma. That there is something in terms of sort of food miles and carbon emissions and so on. The best thing you can do is basically to, contrary to that example, is actually to eat further down the food chain, generally. Keeping animals, whether for meat or for dairy or whatever, tends to be much more intensive in terms of energy and water and transportation of feed and taking land and so on. So apparently a completely local diet, someone has worked out, would reduce a household's greenhouse emissions much, much more than than just sort of looking at sort of food miles. Yeah. So there's no rules, but I do think that in a way, a sort of simple way of doing it is just sort of looking at where we get our food from and not buying into the whole industrial complex around food as much as we can. So, supermarkets and the sort of supply chains that supermarkets have, which are sort of global, intensive in terms of transport, they tend to put more and more sugar and fat in to try and get you hooked and so on. I think in a way the simplest thing we can do is just try and step out of that as much as we can. Just don't have anything to do with it as much as possible. So, things like local organic schemes and so on, or more sort of ethical lines of supply, like, I don't know, Suma Whole Foods, for example. We use them quite a lot. There's no guarantee of being ethical, but it definitely helps, I think. It definitely helps. But the point is, it's hard. The point is, it's not, we're not going to be perfect. Unless you do have your own little private allotment and you manage to get all your nutrition from that without it using any sort of chemicals and so on. We're not in a position to do that, most of us. So when it's not going to be perfect, and I don't think there's a sort of an absolute sort of right choice we can make in terms of do we think it's more important to look after our own health, or do I think it's more important to eat locally rather than necessarily be vegan and so on. I think just trying to get away from that sort of rules-based approach is really important. I think what we need to do is just sort of think, well, what's our next step in a way? What's the next thing we can do? And at the heart of it, we just need to sort of wake up to the sheer livingness of the world around us, the sort of sheer livingness of animals, of ourselves, other people, of animals, and sort of understanding that our sort of source of food, we're on this little shared little planet, and it's everything we do is impacting on other people and other species. Let's not get into sort of hectoring mode, but just do it out of sort of sheer love and joy. I think that's the important thing. This becomes part of just a waking up to loving life in ourselves and in other.